Thank you, Sabrina, for what you said, and thank you for yeah. There's a I think that my whole effort here is kind of pushing a boundary between my ideas and my experiences and my observations of brain injury. And with regard, I'm just going to read my disclaimer first. And if anyone wants to share anything and it is personal, feel free or perhaps don't. This is a forum for ideas at this point, but I think that if these ideas help anyone, then that's very I guess, helpful for me to know that. So my disclaimer is that the views and opinions expressed in this BIAWA presentation are intended for educational and informational purposes only. The views and opinions expressed here by me, Daniel Avesar, come from my personal experiences and observations of other brain-injured individuals, and research and citations supporting these statements are provided when possible to the best of my ability. This presentation is not intended to substitute for professional, medical, or therapeutic advice for diagnosis or for treatment. Always seek the advice of a qualified healthcare provider with questions
I
about
don't
brain
know.
injury treatment, diagnosis, and care, and
Bye.
sorry, never disregard the advice of a professional caregiver because of something you have heard as part of this series. So, in the last talk, I characterized what I called the brain injury problems, and that list that we went over in detail includes having many problems. Every person has many problems that has a brain injury. These can be looked at as strange and stranger than strange, both core and ripple problems. There is interconnectivity between these problems. There is a constantness that changes. These problems evolve over time, and they are invisible. I think that I was describing this to my wife, and she said to me, "Why are you talking about this?" And it was interesting because she doesn't have a brain injury. And she said to me, "Well, don't people know what these brain injury problems are?" And I said, "No." And having that she hadn't dealt with it, she doesn't know how difficult that can be. So, given this layer or this first layer, this primary layer of brain injury problems, what other layers of invisible problems does a brain injured person have to deal with? And I pose this question, but my answer is so if what I just said, the core brain injury problems, all these characteristics, let's take that. It feels like this. It's like there's an artistic representation of it, and we'll put that in the center. The next layer, anyone want to guess? It is the fatigue. The fatigue with brain injury. It needs capitalized, bold, and underlined. Needs to be noted like that because it's a hard thing to explain. It's an overwhelming experience. I don't even know what it is, to be honest. And when I listen to people try to explain it, it's kind of all over the place. So how can you explain it? It's very difficult to do. And the other questions that I have is what can be done to prevent it and manage it? That's what we're going to get into in the next talk. But the context or precursor for that is what I'm going to talk about here. So the fatigue with brain injury is an overwhelming and encompassing exhaustion that comes from having physical injury to the brain. And I think there are different variations and forms of this fatigue. They range from a constant low level of exhaustion to an inability to think, function, and be clear in your head, which I hear other people call brain fog. And I never had brain fog, or I never described it as that. So I believe I'm using the term that is out there now. And it ranges from that to a complete and overwhelming mental or bodily exhaustion where you basically cannot do anything. Um, the fatigue, I postulate that it is the result of having an inefficiently functioning brain due to physical injury to the way the brain is connected and working and functioning and supported by, the nervous system, the vascular system, and all the other nutrient, inputs that they take. I think about don't know if you guys can see the bottom of this, but I think about the nervous system and the brain as functioning in a constant way. There's a lot of research and focus on the brain functioning with a specific task or a specific event, or the brain is doing this when this is happening. But I think it's easy to forget that the brain is constantly functioning in the background and constantly churning things out, constantly doing many, many levels of who knows what, because the research is only showing that now. It's hard to know exactly what it's doing. Needless to say, that when that can't work, when that isn't properly functioning, and then you hit yourself with another stress or another task or effort, that's when the exhaustion takes over, and it's something that it just doesn't allow a person to function when they hit that state. So the fatigue exacerbates and worsens all other brain injury problems. I think in the last seminar, people were asking questions about this, and this topic came up, and um, someone had shared their experience, but other people related, and it just makes everything completely different and much worse. The fatigue makes functioning, makes moving, makes doing almost anything near impossible, and yet I now know many people who are put into that state and then still have to function, still have to live, still have to dig deep and find a way to do things in their lives, and they're not really doing it well, and that's a very bad situation to be in. So the fatigue, that's on top of the brain injury problems. And I don't have any data or research to explain what the fatigue is, but here are 4 talks, and when I give Sabrina these slides, you guys, anyone can look at these. These are talks about how to prevent and manage the fatigue and how to avoid getting into that state. And that's going to be one of the main points that we get into in the next talk series. But here are 4 good videos that I have found that touch on that. So if the fatigue and brain injury problems are 2 different layers of internal experience, internal problems, if you will, then what are other levels to consider? What are other levels that we can talk about? So in order to answer that question, I'm going to draw from, this is a report that came out from the National Academies of Sciences last year, and I presented on it in my talk series, Building Brain Awareness to Help Support Brain Injury. I presented on it about 10 months ago, and I basically summarized what they had said and sort of found all the points that they talk about that are consistent with my experiences and observations. But in this report that has like a whole, council behind it, they talk about this biopsychosocial ecological lens. So TBI, traumatic brain injury, needs to be viewed and managed as a condition. Sorry, I cannot see all my slides, but that's okay. As a condition that's not a one-time condition, but it needs to be viewed as a framework and an event that has happened since the condition. They kind of are not so specific in how to look at that, but they say that it should not be looked at a one-time event, which I agree with 100%. The biopsychosocial ecological model recognizes, and this is the model that they proposed, that injury and recovery are influenced by an interplay of many elements: physical, medical, psychological, behavioral, social, and economic. And this framework enables a more complete understanding of the complex condition, which is brain injury. And they went on to explain how this model can be looked at to sort of affect the healthcare trajectory of a person. And you want to factor in all these, all these factors, all these extra lenses that they threw in. And ultimately, when I looked at this, I think I summarized in the last presentation, but now I just have some thoughts on it, some more. This is my opinion. I think it's an interesting model, and multidimensional is essential. And this is actually the only thing I've written down. But this model is way too general and not specific enough for brain injury. And just the idea of talking to someone about a biological injury, I couldn't imagine that for any other condition. Like, everything's biological. So they need to be much more specific for brain injury. And they really don't discuss the nervous system and neurology and the brain very much in this report. And that's what I think is one of the pieces that is definitely missing in this. But I do think that the bio and psychological is a good framework to sort of fit in another level of how to think about what brain injury people are dealing with. As for the sociological and it's ecological, right? Of course, those are important factors, and I guess maybe that's outside of the spectrum with which I'm going to be looking at it. So the next layer, given all that, I look at it as a psychological, emotional trauma response layer that encompasses all of the other internal and very, very strange factors that you have to deal with once you have a brain injury. So psychological, emotional trauma response can be looked at as a multi-layer, and it's somewhat equivalent to their P layer in the BPSC model. And I postulate that this response, this is important, I think, it should be looked at as an appropriate and accurate emotional response. Of course, every person is different, and I actually am in no way an expert in psychology or trauma, so I don't want to say too much. But I think that the way people respond to a condition, an internal situation that is kind of breaks your reality, is appropriate and accurate, especially with the fatigue and the way your normal goals, your normal life, and your normal what you're trying to do kind of falls apart and changes drastically. Um, Again, this is all internal and what the person is experiencing, and that statement needs to have a caveat, of course, which is that if a person does have a brain injury problem to a brain system that underlies emotional, psychological, and or any type of response that is involved in emotions and trauma, then that injury should be looked at, or that specific injury in that person should be looked at more as a brain injury problem. And I have met a number of people with injury to the limbic system, injury to their emotional regulation abilities, and I myself has had this. I guess it's called alexithymia, where I didn't have any feelings for about 17 years. And that's definitely a injury to some processing of emotions in me. I have a talk on that, by the way, in my Building Brain Awareness, and I should have cited that, but I forgot to. But alexithymia is a very interesting example of this. But I think that there are many, many more psychological and emotional and trauma response ways that people react to this. And I include that here, that these responses are vast and different. And these responses, as brain injury is not a single event, but a change in you, your responses are to that change and to the way your life changes drastically. In many cases, I have spoken with brain injury people, and in my podcast, I have some examples of this, but a lot more in person, where the person describes a specific psychological or emotional response to a core problem, to having that inability of memory, or having that lost inner self, or having this stranger in myself feeling. There's a number of examples that I've. Each one's a one-on-one interaction, but that causes much deeper emotional reaction and anxiety, sure, and other feelings that come from having that core problem. But I do want to say I see this a lot. But I think one example of the psychological, emotional, or trauma response is thought to be the framing problem or the main problem that is happening to the person, when in fact it's a combination, it's a layering. That's what one of these figures. The brain injury problems are underneath, and the emotional psychological response is happening as well. It's certainly not the other thing happening.
Hey, Dan, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. You sound like you're a bit underwater at the moment. I think it might
Oh,
be.
geez.
Oh, no, you sound fine now. Okay, keep going. Sorry.
Have I been underwater this whole time?
Nope, just for like the last minute or so, but you sound great
Oh,
now. So
okay. Well, I'm
go.
trying these headphones, and I just pushed it in a little bit. Make sure the connection's right. Okay. Thanks. Okay, so the next layer after the brain injury problems, the fatigue, and the psychological emotional trauma response layers. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think there's a layer of interpretation. And almost every single brain injury person I've spoken to has this. And what I mean by this layer of interpretation, it's that you have these internal problems and you have what is happening in you kind of live, and you need to have an answer for that. You need to have an awareness for that. An interpretation of it and what is happening is a good way to look at it. And this interpretation applies to all the deeper layers, meaning it also applies to the fatigue. It also applies to the psychological feelings that come from the core problems. But you can be unable to function because of the brain injury problems plus the fatigue, and then look at yourself as just a piece of nothing, and you're so lazy, when in fact it's the fatigue that is keeping you from doing anything, or worse, maybe injury to some of the processes that are involved in motivation and initiation. There's so many examples of this. The awareness is kind of a term that I have used with other brain injury people, and when I talk to them about this, I've had more than one discussion with, like, oh, you're talking about the awareness, and it's like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And I think that I've met also people who have this capacity, or the capacity for the awareness of what they have injured, to be injured itself. But I've spoken maybe with two people that they have learned this, and with the right support and the right treatment and the right therapy and the right sort of professional advice about it, they have gained the awareness. So just like the caveat in the earlier layer, that this capacity for awareness can be injured, and it can be relearned and regained. At least from what I've observed, it can. It also can be. Did I write this here? So in my experience, sorry, this is where I spend most of my time in my head after my brain injury. And the podcast that I have, I call Experiencing My Brain, is where I get into deep, deep discussion with brain injured people about what they're aware of. And there's a lot to say. And so far, most people I've been able to just go with it. I don't even know them. And we start talking about it, and there's just a well of information and awareness of what they have had to deal with, what they've built awareness for, and how they manage it and learn to live with it, and in some cases improve it. And Experiencing My Brain is my name for this perspective. And I swear I was basically stuck like this for 7 years and observing it in me, categorizing what was wrong with me, and working on myself to fix it. So I forgot to put one more slide, but I wanted to say that this is where I think denial, I think delusion, and I think actually here it is. So this is that what I was about to say. So the development of accurate awareness can be very hard to do, or it can be very obvious. Some people have injury to their vision system. Some people have injury to something that's very clear, in which case it's obvious. But if it's not, then the delusion, denial, and confabulation that stem from an inability to have an internal grasp of what the problems are, what the stranger than strange problem is, for example, or what the connectivity between them is, it's just a very weird mental place to be. And I can't see my slide here, but it's okay. The lack of understanding and the inability to accept, this kind of idea. I run into that when I speak to unbrain injured people, or it's just another layer of misunderstanding that can happen. Meanwhile, a brain injured person can be pretty aware of what they're dealing with, trying to explain it to the outside world. And if the outside world doesn't know what we're talking about, then you just run into a lot of barriers. But sharing this and talking to other brain injured people about this is where I find a very deep value in speaking with other people that have been through this. And I wanted to share a few. These are all people that I've met in the last year, I'd say, brain injured people. The Brain Fairy is Linda. Don Corbelli has a book and a blog. Hoda is with Chris, and Michelle and Lisa run the Brain Network. And basically, these are all brain injured people who are aware of this stuff enough, or aware of the problems, and they're building their own dialogue and supporting the awareness in other people, as well as other forms of support. And I almost find them as their evidence, because I don't have anyone else to cite, but I see these people working on this every day, as well as support, as well as finding ways to create resources and all the other problems. But I think the awareness is a big factor. So, and my podcast and my talk series too. This is the same point. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, and this is the last point for this talk, but there's a moment to moment level of changes, level of internal shifts that happen when you have a brain injury. And I think for brain injured people, we're well aware of this. And for people who are not so brain injured, it's hard to imagine. But one level of what is moment to moment changing in you can be the brain injury problems, or the way they interconnect, or all these other characteristics. This is a list of many things here. The next is the fatigue. It can just come on like basically like a sledgehammer that takes you out, and you didn't even realize it was going to happen. Then there's the psychological, emotional. And I remember in my first few years of brain injury, I would run into the problems, I would hit the wall, and there was this frustration and anxiety that I was going to be stuck like that. And the frustration would always happen when I ran into what I couldn't do. And I'd sit with the frustration, and then the anxiety was, I hope I'm not like this the rest of my life. And it was a horrible cycle. Probably 4 years like that, 5 years, I don't know. And then the last layer is the interpretation. And I think that these levels and these layers can bounce around in a person's head. And it's like you're shifting between this, you're shifting between that. Now I have learned this interpretation for what I'm experiencing. So that helps, but I still had the problem. And then I had to learn to not manage it this way, but manage it that way. And it's just, it's a chaotic mess. But these are all internal, and these all can change, moment to moment within us. And okay, that's it. So This presentation and the last one, these two presentations have been an attempt to characterize the nature of brain injury problems from an internal perspective. And the next two talks are, sorry, the next one talk is going to be, it was two talks initially, but it's characterizing some of these examples and how they manifest in the real world, because what the real world sees is not really what we're dealing with, or that there can be misinterpretation and sort of lost in translation there, a loss of translation. And the other thing is, what are some things persons can do or people can do to improve their lives with brain injury? And from that, I draw on my experiences, but also what I have found out there and what I have recorded from other people who have had a brain injury and work to improve things. But that is all for this talk. So let's get out of me sharing, and any questions or what? Yeah.
Feel free to come off mute if you have questions. Put questions in the chat if you have them. There is a question in the chat now already. That was quick.
Yeah. Sabrina, do I push new share? Because I don't want to push that to stop sharing. Oh, stop share. Never mind.
There you go. There is a question in the chat from Brenna. Brenna says, last time you talked about the horror stories of neuropsych evaluations. Do you have any research that could be used to show that they do not work well for anything besides severe TBI or dementia?
No, I don't have any research on that, and I wish I did. And I have been looking, and the only thing that I can say, so across this whole process, I feel like I'm like sleuthing around trying to find stuff. And also, I don't have academic access. So research has been harder, but I have looked for that and I haven't found it. And I have found it was a talk that I went to through NASHIA, and they were talking about the history, National Association of State Head Injury Advisors. And it was like representation from all states. And they had a presentation, and one of the earlier ones, because there was a whole seminar, was on the history of these neuropsych testings. And it basically came from all these other psychological or neuropsychological conditions. So it's like a process where they're like, okay, we have this problem, we need to rule that out. We have this problem, we need to test for that. We have this problem. And nothing about it was for brain injury. And it just kind of was illuminating to think of how we can fall through the cracks. It's because these tests are not designed for these kinds of problems. Brain injury has a lot of symptoms that are like other symptoms or other condition symptoms, but I don't believe they have the same basis. So I think that no, I don't have any evidence. Sorry, and it's very frustrating to not be able to say that, but I just keep hearing similar stories, and yeah, sorry.
Well, yeah, Dr. Fong at Cognitive FX, she's the one who told me it's only good for dementia, severe brain injuries, maybe Parkinson's, but I can't find anything. So I was hoping you did. But
sorry, but that just know that that's sort of the case with a lot of this stuff, and I have been reading the Cognitive FX blogs, and I get their emails. I like their stuff, and then some stuff I'm like, oh, that's a good example of thinking that it's only the psychological. I'm reading their stuff pretty regularly. Yeah, cannot help.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
And then there was another sort of follow-up question from Brian. Says, are there different types of neuropsych exams? I had an 8-hour neuropsych test and it was intense and didn't evaluate TBI.
Yeah, so I am not a neuropsychologist. I have a non-clinical degree, but I can say that I believe that there's some general tests, and then there's like certain psychologists or certain neuropsychologists subscribe to other types of tests. And I know that the woman Karen McAvoy, she's a PsyD, and she presented in my talk series, and I talked about her in the last talk. She has like a 20-minute assessment that she's developed because she's not going to put anyone through that. And just her acknowledgement of how torturous and difficult that is for a person, and then you end up getting nothing from it. It's not the best method. So no, I don't know enough about that kind of testing. I do know from the speech therapist that they have all these different kinds of tests for all these different pinpointing of problems, but that's downstream from the neuropsych testing. So I don't know enough about that field. Somebody asked in the chat, if cognitive FX is worth it. And I'll tell you something that I've observed with a lot of clinical groups and places that I've tried to talk to. I think that a lot of times they can help if they are aware with dealing with what your problem is. So then it's almost like a lock and key, or like if I have this problem and this therapist knows about that and they can assess it and figure it out, then they might be a great help to you. But I've sort of heard good and bad things from all the places that are out there now. And it's interesting just to talk to people about that, because maybe it's a sign of a bigger problem. But if they can find what you're working on and what you need help with, then it could be a great place. And I don't know much about them otherwise. Someone said that their son has gone twice. I would say yes. So, any other questions?
I have a question
Yes.
about I have epilepsy, and can you discuss that? It came after a encephalitis.
Okay.
Do you have anything specific to say about that kind of brain injury?
Well, the encephalitis or the seizures, or both?
Both.
Yeah. Do you know? I know that epilepsy and seizures are something that is studied more, is researched and somewhat understood more. Do you know where you had where the source of it is? Is it medial temporal lobe region or some other part of the brain? Yeah. I think that that's sort of the, anyone that I hear talk about that, they always have the seizures from that brain region. And I guess there's a lot that is known, and they have certain treatments and certain pharmacology, but I don't really know how effective they are. Like in your experience, have you found anything that is beneficial or helpful?
Anti-seizure medicine, and rest.
Yeah. The rest is the biggest part. I mean, in the next talk, I'm basically, one of the big things that I want to get into on the fatigue slides that I give, they're all this advice on how to manage yourself from hitting the point of going too far. And that took me 3 years to realize and 4 years to implement. And then over the 5th, 6th, and 7th years of my brain injury, I really felt it change. And I have 2 discussions on my podcast where people describe the same lesson learned. And then I want to like just try to get everyone to know that. But for many people, it's not possible because they support themselves, or there's too many things. And it's also a very strange gray area where you don't know where is too far. So then how do you create the rest? And then how do you feel satisfied with yourself? I found that part of my life very, when I was doing it right, I wasn't happy with my life. But I think that there's a lot that can be improved in that sense. Do you know if, have you found exercise to be effective in dealing with it? And
my balance is pretty bad, and that's both from the epilepsy and from the seizure medicine, I've been told. So it's always a balance. It always feels good when I can get out and move, but just like yeah, Tai Chi, if it's not moving around, if it's not too if there's not too much twirling, Tai Chi is okay. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Finding those outlets and restoratives is what I've heard the therapists and sort of patients that are effective in using exercise for their benefit. I know there's a lot of the neurotrophic factor benefits has also been studied very much in the hippocampus and medial temporal regions, and that I think is one thing that people can do that is beneficial. It may seem counterintuitive, but it's helpful for the overall brain, longevity, recovery, and I guess recovery is the right word, but rebuilding and regaining and restoring the function. So I think that was something that I would recommend. But yeah, I know more about epilepsy research and brain models and rodents, and specifically in the medial temporal lobe, to extrapolate much more than that. So magnesium, yeah, I think So in the next talk, which I could just like explain parts of it now, but I think that exercise, sleep, nutrition, and finding this social outlet so that we're not isolated are four things that any person can do for themselves. And it doesn't seem like much. And also when you're brain injured, you're like, I don't have time to deal with this, but it actually is very beneficial. And those things keep coming up in my podcast from people. And I'm very careful when I talk to people. I don't want to influence them in any way. I almost feel like I'm a anthropologist that I answer them like, okay, what's your brain injury like? And tell me, but I'm not going to tell you anything. So those factors come up over and over. And someone just put magnesium B complex and yeah, nutritional, doing the right supplements and the right diet. Okay. Thank you
Thank you.
all. Yeah,
Can I ask one more question?
absolutely. Yeah, please.
You talked at one point about like not having feelings and you gave it a term, but I didn't quite catch what that
Oh,
term was.
the term is alexithymia, and I always confuse the Y and the I in the spelling, but I think that the technical term for that means like an inability or a lack of awareness of emotion. And I didn't realize I had it until a few years ago. And then I um, became emotional about that. And it's been a process to gain access to my feelings. In my talk series, The Building Brain Awareness, um, there's a researcher, Dawn Newman. She's at University of Indiana, and this is her one of her expertise. And I really appreciated her presentation because she talks about that this is like present in very high fold in brain injured people, and it's not really known about. And by the end of her talk, she's basically just making this case where people don't even know about this condition. And as soon as I learned about it, it hit me like, oh wow, that is something that I'm dealing with, and I didn't realize it. That's an example of that building an awareness of it because once I recognized that, I started to work on it, and it didn't make it easier, but it made it at least have a framework. Um, I believe that any brain injury can lead to a process being injured, and then having awareness of it is, completely something that can also be injured. So in this case, it's emotions and the feeling of feelings. Do you have any questions about it? Because I could talk about it.
Well, my son had told me that he felt like he only had like 50% of his feelings after the
Mm-hmm.
brain injury. So when you said that, I was just like, oh, what can I call that? So that he, one thing about cognitive FX that was good for my son is he was able to be with people that also had brain injuries and feel like he wasn't crazy.
Yes.
So anytime I can point out something to him, hey, I heard this, I think it's helpful for him because I gave him the last recording for your last talk, and he took a look at 55 minutes and put his phone down. He was overwhelmed right there. So I try to just give him little tidbits.
Yeah, I'm also I've gotten that input many times, like make it shorter. I'm like, okay, I will. But at this point, I just feel like I'm doing like a first capture of as much as I can, and then I'll narrow it down and clean it up. But I didn't know about that. Um, I realized that I didn't have my feelings 17 years after my brain injury. I learned about alexithymia maybe 2 years after that. And then by the time I talked to Don Newman, got her to do the presentation in my talk series, it was like, okay, now I'm at least starting to grasp awareness of it. Yeah, it's a strange one. Um, Anyone else? There's a
Thanks.
hand up.
Yeah, there's a hand up with
Yes,
Dawn.
Dawn. Hi, Dawn. Sorry, Dawn, you're muted or still muted, or I don't know. I can't hear you.
Does not appear that Dawn is muted. Yeah, Dawn, we still can't hear you.
Sorry, Dawn. Can you type it in the chat because we can't hear you? Ah, frustrations of technology. Um, guess if we have no more questions and we can't get to Dawn, then I think this is good. The last talk was actually a little longer than I had intended, and I'm hoping to do these talks shorter so that, you know, that's part of the goal, right? So I think that this has been good, and thank you all. And I don't know. You can also email me if you have any questions, or maybe we'll turn off the recording. What do you think, Sabrina?
Yeah, actually, Dawn's question came through.
Great.
Can you tell how doctors can rule out dementia versus effects of a TBI? Is this question in a nutshell?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think that they can unless it's a good doctor who knows what they're dealing with, because dementia has a kind of degenerative nature, and if brain injury is the culprit and you know about the physical injury, or there could be all different kinds of acquired brain injury. So if you have that source, or that again, it's a sleuthing, it's a figuring out of what happened. So if there's a clear head trauma or head injury or something that caused the injury to the brain from an external chemical source, for example, or then you can start to rule it out. But if it's like you just arrive onto the scene and you're trying to figure it out, then it's rather difficult. But I think that with although there are characteristics that are similar between them, in my brain injury recovery and work to restore what I had lost, the other part of the next talk is going to be about this baby step effort and trying to do what you cannot do. And it's very, very frustrating with brain injury when you lose these capacities. It almost every step, especially initially, is extremely difficult. But as you do the step and as you do it over and over and over, I've spoken to enough brain injury people that it slowly gets easier, slowly gets better. And then it's not like now you can do it. Now you just get to the next step, and then the combinations of steps. The repetition takes a long time and improves things, and you can actually kind of feel it. And I don't know if that's a characteristic of dementia. So I wish I had a better answer, but I think that with dementia, the changes just present themselves differently. And Don, was there a brain injury specifically in this case that you're interested in? Like a head bump or something?
Looks like yes. Don's shaking his head.
Okay, then that's good. And then the other problem is convincing the doctors. I know more than a few people here that I'm like, oh, they're trying to work with the doctors that don't really get it. So it's hard to, I think finding the right expert in that sense would be very, very helpful. And if you know that there was a brain injury, that's important, because you can tell them, hey, listen, this is what I'm dealing with. And then there's enough of these brain injury clinics out there, the Cleveland one, Cognitive FX, and what's Karen McAvoy's, I can't remember hers. It's some obscure word that I don't know. It means hope in Hindi. Whatever hope in Hindi is as a word, that's the name of her clinic. But there are places that you can go to get help. And I guess in some cases, that's the best option. In other cases, maybe you can find a good neurologist or neuropsychologist that gets it. But yeah, there's a lot of similarities, but they're not the same thing. And the improvement for brain injury, it kind of can have this trajectory with the right support and work.
Thanks, Dan. Are there
Thank
any
you.
other questions? Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining. Dan, not to put you on the spot, but I do believe that you said that slides would be available, not right away, but you're working on getting some slides available from last week, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
So and I will get the ones from today and last week. I've kind of compiled them all into one talk, but yeah, I'll have them. I'll get them to you tonight. So yeah.
Okay. I will no, don't rush. Well, we can send them out actually next week after all 3 of your classes, if that's easier, so I'm not spamming everyone with emails. So no rush on this.
Yeah, that might be the best way, because I envisioned this as one big talk, and then when this opportunity came out, I was like, okay, I can break it up. It's also forcing me to think about how to explain this. So I'm reading Dawn's message, and they ruled out dementia, and I can't remember why though. And so that's good. So in that case, the ruling out, and there's a lot of criteria and a lot of ways that they can diagnose. There's biomarkers. There's all this stuff they can do. The problem is that like with dementia and with brain injury, there could be losses of specific capacities. Was there involved in cognition? Was there involved in learning and memory? And then with brain injury, the very difficult process, but it's not the most difficult. It's a relearning, rebuilding, working on it to restore it. And that's the thing that I'm going to talk about in the next talk. I experienced that, and I've met enough people like me that I'm like, okay, relearning has its own characteristics, and it's very I don't know, it just has its own difficult nature, but it's not impossible. So if it's not dementia, that's a good thing. Asha Brain Clinics. Yes, Asha is the word. Thank you, Brenna. Okay, cool. Now I want to read the chat. There's a bunch of stuff going on here. Something from Brian. I honestly don't know which state is better, and I've heard a lot of good things in Colorado, but he's asking about relocating. Yeah, I've heard a number of good things in Colorado, but honestly, with every place and every hospital and every you go somewhere, you think they're going to be good, and then in my experience and many people I met there, you still have to find the right people. They're not out there with ease, and that's a difficult process, especially when you're brain injured. So, yeah. All right. I think that's good. Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And remember, we have another class next week, same time, same place, same Zoom link, 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time when it's dark out already. Looking forward to seeing all of you next week. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Daniel. You're amazing as usual. Really.
Did you like the topics in this talk?
Loved
Sabrina?
it.
Okay, cool. Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.